The stale breath of the office building floor with too many cubicles clung to the air, a persistent blend of toner, lukewarm coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of too many machines humming in concert. My own cubicle, a precise rectangle in a sea of identical partitions, felt less like a workspace and more like a carefully measured coffin. Each morning, I would trace the same paths across my desk, arranging my instruments with a ritualistic exactitude, the polished brass dividers, the fine-tipped pens, the magnifying loupe whose lens, like a patient eye, had surveyed countless centuries of human endeavor. As a historical cartographer, I found solace in the immutable lines of the past, in the documented shifts of rivers and the steadfast rise of mountains, in the meticulous, verifiable truth of a well-drawn map. Today, however, the familiar comfort of my routine felt thin, stretched. The drone of distant conversations, muted by the fabric walls, seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the very bones of the building. My current project, a meticulously reconstructed trade route from the late 17th century, lay open before me, its intricate details offering no respite. My focus, usually an unyielding blade, felt dulled, softened by an inexplicable current of unease that had begun to eddy around me since the arrival of the solicitor's letter. It had arrived 2 days prior, a heavy envelope of cream-colored vellum, sealed with a wax impression of a crest I did not recognize. The contents, penned in an archaic script that spoke of generations past, informed me of an inheritance, a remote, decaying ancestral estate, nestled deep within a forgotten pocket of the northern wilderness. The words ancient, secluded, and unoccupied for decades were threaded through the formal language, each one a prickle of cold on my skin. I had no memory of such a place, no living relatives I knew who could bequeath such a legacy. My family tree, as far as I had ever bothered to trace it, had withered into a few sparse branches, each clearly accounted for. This estate, then, was an unexpected, unsettling bloom. Driven by a cartographer's inherent need for verification, for the solid ground of fact, I had arranged to visit the property. The journey itself had been a gradual shedding of the known world. Highways dwindled to paved roads, then to gravel tracks, until finally, I found myself on a barely discernible trail, swallowed by a forest so ancient its trees seemed to groan with the weight of centuries. The estate itself materialized from the mist-shrouded landscape like a ghost, a sprawling, stone edifice, its slate roof sagging, windows like vacant eyes staring out over overgrown gardens. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something subtly metallic, like distant rain on rust. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of dust and shadows. My footsteps echoed, swallowed by the cavernous rooms. The solicitor, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with an expression of mild distaste, pointed me towards a small, oak-paneled study. Family effects, he had murmured, his voice hushed, mostly papers. It was there, tucked beneath a stack of brittle ledgers in a locked chest, that I found it. The map. It was not a modern survey, nor even a standard historical plat. This was something else entirely. The paper, a rich, mottled cream, bore the faint, sweet scent of decay and something else, a mineral dampness, like stone exposed to perpetual mist. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth precision of modern prints, felt the subtle irregularities of the hand-drawn lines, the raised texture of the ink. The map depicted the estate, its boundaries meticulously rendered, but the style was unlike anything I had ever encountered. The lines of the estate's perimeter were drawn with an almost obsessive precision, each curve and angle rendered with an unnerving exactitude. Yet, within those boundaries, the map defied all conventional cartographic logic. Certain sections, particularly those denoting the deeper woods and the low-lying marshlands to the north, simply ended, unresolved, like unfinished thoughts. Vast swaths were left blank, yet bordered by a series of strange, unsettling symbols. These glyphs were not the familiar icons of geological features or man-made structures. They were intricate, almost organic, resembling skeletal trees whose roots plunged impossibly deep, or perhaps stylized veins branching out from an unseen heart. They pulsed with an unspoken history, a language I almost understood, but couldn't quite grasp. There were no compass roses, no legends, no title block to orient Maine. Instead, a single, looping inscription in a forgotten tongue adorned the bottom margin, its unfamiliar script a serpentine crawl across the parchment. My cartographer's mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and order, immediately sought explanation, verification. But the map offered none. It was a contradiction, a paradox of meticulous detail and glaring incompleteness. It was an enigma, exquisitely crafted, yet profoundly disturbing. The drone of fluorescent lights, a persistent, low hum, had woven itself into the fabric of my days, a constant reminder of the precise, predictable parameters of my existence. Its parchment, brittle with age, whispered of a different kind of precision, one rooted not in digital grids, but in the earth's ancient memory. The journey to the estate was a blur of asphalt and encroaching green, each mile peeling away the sterile layers of the city. When I finally navigated the winding, rutted track that served as its approach, the estate loomed, a silhouette against a sky bruised with twilight. The house itself was a skeletal grandeur, its gables sharp teeth against the fading light, its windows dark, unblinking eyes. But it was the land that truly drew me, a wilderness reclaiming its own. Then, with the ancestral map spread across the warped oak table in what I assumed was once the library, I began my work. The map was a marvel of intricate lines and symbols, depicting the estate with a specificity that bordered on obsession. My cartographer's instinct, honed by years of meticulous historical reconstruction, demanded its completion. Armed with the map, a compass, and a surveyor's chain, I ventured into the overgrown expanse. The initial thrill of discovery was a potent stimulant, pushing aside the creeping unease that had settled in my periphery. The modern deeds, a sparse, utilitarian document, offered little more than boundary lines. The ancestral map, however, painted a far richer, more complex tapestry. It showed ancient paths now swallowed by bramble, forgotten streams, and, most intriguingly, several structures that simply did not exist on any contemporary record. My first significant find was a cluster of weathered stone foundations, barely visible beneath a suffocating blanket of ivy and moss, nestled deep within a section of woods marked only by an enigmatic, spiraling symbol on the old parchment. These were not the ruins of a collapsed barn or an old shed. The sheer heft of the stones, their crude, interlocking arrangement, hinted at something far older, far more purposeful. The air around them was strangely still, almost heavy, as if sound itself was muffled. They were arranged in a loose, irregular circle, half buried in the earth, their tallest point reaching only to my chest. I spun around, my heart giving an unwelcome jolt, but saw nothing, only the dense, silent wall of trees. Not merely the absence of light, but something more substantial, more present. They seemed unnaturally deep, absorbing the already fading light with an almost hungry intensity, refusing to yield to the encroaching afternoon sun. My modern compass, usually a reliable guide, occasionally wavered, its needle quivering with an agitated uncertainty as I approached these denser patches of gloom. Each discrepancy, each strange detail, pulled me deeper into the land's hidden narrative. The cartographer in me was thrilled by the challenge, the promise of unearthing a forgotten history. These weren't just anomalies, they felt like deliberate omissions, like secrets buried not just by time, but by something more deliberate, something that did not wish to be found. And yet, the map, that silent, insistent guide, was leading me directly to them. It was the white noise of my meticulously catalogued tomb of forgotten aspirations, an endless, sterile drone that had once offered a perverse comfort in its predictability. But that comfort had begun to fray, unraveling thread by thread since the estate's grim inheritance had settled upon my shoulders. My gaze, meant for the intricate topographical lines on the digital map displayed on my monitor, kept straying. It drifted to the edges of my vision, where the air itself seemed to thicken, to waver. Fleetingly, at the very periphery, I would catch a movement, a shadow, perhaps, darker than the usual gray of the cubicle walls, a quickening ripple in the stagnant air. When I snapped my head to confront it, there was nothing. Only the bland fabric of the partition, the inert plastic of a colleague's discarded coffee cup, the unblinking red eye of a fire alarm. My mind, a fortress of logic and empirical data, dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the optic nerve, the inevitable consequence of too many late nights spent poring over the ancestral map. Yet, the occurrences began to needle at the edges of my composure, like tiny, sharp barbs. At first, it was the papers on my desk. A carefully stacked sheaf of survey documents, their corners crisp and aligned, would appear subtly askew after I'd stepped away for a moment. A pen, placed precisely beside my keyboard, would migrate to the far corner of the cubicle, nestled incongruously amongst a pile of unused sticky notes. These were trifles, easily attributed to a clumsy hand, a forgotten gust from the ventilation, or even the absent-mindedness of a cleaning crew. I rationalized each instance, constructing elaborate, mundane explanations, each one a tiny brick in the crumbling wall of my certainty. Then came the whispers. Disembodied, ephemeral, they slithered through the drone of the office, barely audible above the clatter of keyboards and the distant murmur of telephone conversations. They were not words, not precisely. I'd freeze, straining to decipher the sound, convinced a colleague was attempting to get my attention. But when I'd swivel in my chair, the office floor with its too many cubicles would be a tableau of ordinary industry, every head bent, every face absorbed. No one met my gaze, no one seemed to have spoken a syllable. Sleep, once a deep, restorative plunge into oblivion, had become a treacherous landscape. Nightmares, vivid and unsettling, clawed their way into my subconscious. They were not the usual anxieties of deadlines or professional missteps. Instead, I found myself wandering the decaying halls of the estate, the floorboards groaning underfoot, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and metallic. I saw the map, not on my desk, but spread across a vast, stone table, its lines shifting, writhing like veins beneath my touch. The hidden features, once abstract symbols, would swell and pulse, taking on an organic, almost menacing life. One particular morning, after a night haunted by visions of roots snaking through the estate's foundations, I returned to my work. I had left the ancestral map, a printout of my digital recreation, tucked carefully beneath a heavy book on my desk. Now, it lay exposed, its edges slightly curled, as if it had been handled. My breath hitched. I smoothed it down, my fingers tracing the familiar lines. But something was different. Along the southern border, where the map depicted a dense copse of ancient oaks, a series of faint, almost invisible lines had appeared. They were too precise to be a trick of the light, too deliberate to be a smudge. They formed a delicate, intricate pattern, like the tracery of frost on a window pane, hinting at a structure, or perhaps a path, that had not been there the previous evening. My rational mind screamed for a logical explanation, a printer error, a latent ink bleeding through, a forgotten pencil mark. But my hands, trembling slightly, knew better. The estate, no longer a distant memory or an abstract problem, had found its way into the precise, ordered confines of my life, asserting its presence with an unsettling, undeniable force.